It's July 2010. Inside a crowded, noisy pizza parlor in Los Angeles, an older man is enjoying a meal. He's a neighborhood fixture, a retired mechanic, a friendly face who's always ready to help a friend with a car engine. He eats his pizza, wipes his mouth, and leaves the crust behind on a white paper plate as he walks out the door. He has no idea that the busboy who swoops in to clear his table isn't looking for a tip. He's an undercover LAPD officer, and that half-eaten pizza crust isn't trash. It's the most sought-after piece of forensic evidence in California history. For 25 years, a predator had been stalking the alleyways of South Los Angeles. He was a shadow that moved through the height of the crack epidemic, leaving a trail of young women discarded under old mattresses and wrapped in scrap carpet. The police knew he was out there. They had the DNA, they had the ballistic matches, but for 2 decades, they kept his existence a secret from the very community he was hunting. They called him the Grim Sleeper because after a flurry of kills in the 1980s, the trail seemingly went cold for 14 years. The world thought he had stopped. They thought he had simply disappeared into the smog of the city. But as the DNA from that pizza crust was rushed to a lab, the terrifying truth began to emerge. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been hiding in plain sight, working for the city, fixing police cars, and taking thousands of photographs of women who may never be seen again. This is the story of Lonnie Franklin Jr. It's a case of a community betrayed by the people sworn to protect them, a forensic miracle that took a quarter century to arrive, and the chilling realization that the sleeper may have never actually closed his eyes. To understand how Lonnie Franklin Jr. operated for 25 years without being caught, you have to understand the environment of South Los Angeles in the 1980s. This wasn't the glitz and glamour of Hollywood or the sunset strips of the postcards. This was a community caught in the crosshairs of the crack cocaine epidemic. The streets were flooded with a drug that moved like a wildfire, tearing through families and creating a desperate, vulnerable population of women who were often forced into the margins of society just to survive. In the eyes of the LAPD at the time, these women were often categorized as NHI, no humans involved. It was a shorthand used by some officers to dismiss crimes committed against sex workers, drug users, and the impoverished. This was the hunting ground. Between 1985 and 1988, bodies began appearing with terrifying frequency. They were found in the most undignified places, tossed behind dumpsters, in narrow alleyways, hidden under discarded plywood, or tucked into the folds of old mattresses left on the curb. The victims were young, black, and beautiful, women like Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, and Barbara Ware. But Lonnie Franklin Jr. didn't look like a monster. He didn't skulk in the shadows like a movie villain. He was a man of the neighborhood. Born and raised in South LA, Lonnie was a veteran and a father of two. He was known as a handyman and a car guy. If your engine was knocking or your alternator was shot, you went to Lonnie. He was the guy who would pull up in his tow truck, offer a smile, and fix your problem for a fair price. He even worked as a mechanic for the Los Angeles Police Department and the city's sanitation department. Think about that. The man the city was looking for was the same man fixing their squad cars. He had access to city facilities, he understood police radio traffic, and he knew exactly which neighborhoods were being patrolled and which were being ignored. The LAPD's ballistics laboratory eventually linked the murders to a single .25 caliber handgun. They knew they had a serial killer on their hands. But here is the context that still boils the blood of the community. The police didn't issue a public warning. They didn't hold a press conference. They kept the link a secret, effectively allowing the predator to keep hunting because they believed a public outcry would hinder the investigation. But the silence was broken in 1988 by the only person who could truly tell the world what the monster looked like, Anietra Washington. On a November night, Enietra was walking to a friend's house when a man in an orange Ford Pinto pulled up and offered her a ride. He seemed friendly, he seemed safe. But once she was in the car, the mask slipped. He shot her in the chest with that same .25 caliber pistol. As she lay bleeding in the passenger seat, drifting in and out of consciousness, she saw a bright flash. He wasn't just killing her, he was documenting it. He was taking a photograph of her as she fought for her life. He eventually pushed her out of the moving car and left her for dead in an alley. But Enietra didn't die. She crawled to safety, and her description of the man and his car gave the police the first real lead they'd had in years. But then, suddenly, the killing seemed to stop. The trail went cold. The sleeper had supposedly gone to bed, or so the police thought. For 14 years, the streets of South Los Angeles seemed to settle into an uneasy peace. Between 1988 and 2002, the specific signature of the .25 caliber killer disappeared from the crime scene reports. The detectives who had worked the original task force moved on, retired, or were reassigned. The files were boxed up, labeled cold, and moved to the basement of the LAPD's archives. This is where the name the Grim Sleeper was born. The media and the authorities assumed that the killer had either died, been incarcerated for another crime, or had simply lost the urge to kill. But sleeping implies a period of rest before waking, and in 2002, the city received a terrifying wake up call. It started with the discovery of 15-year-old Princess Bertomeu. Her body was found discarded in an alley in Inglewood, strangled and hidden under a piece of discarded carpet. It was a scene that mirrored the nightmares of the 1980s with haunting precision. When her DNA was processed and run against the state's database, the computer didn't just find a match, it found a ghost. The DNA from Princess Bertomeu was a direct hit to the DNA found on the victims from 1985. The sleeper was back, or, as investigators began to fear, he had never been asleep at all. As the cold case unit began to re examine every unsolved murder of a black woman in the South LA area during that 14-year gap, a disturbing pattern emerged. They found Valerie McCorvey in 2003. They found Janisha Peters in 2007. The ballistics matched. The DNA matched. The sleep was a myth, a failure of data, not a cessation of violence. The killer hadn't stopped. The police had just stopped connecting the dots. The pressure began to mount. The community, led by the Black Coalition fighting back serial murders, was furious. They had been right all along. They had warned the city that their daughters were being hunted, and for 14 years, the silence of the authorities had provided the killer with a dark curtain to hide behind. By 2008, the LAPD formed a new secret task force dubbed the 800 Task Force. They had the DNA profile of the killer, but there was one massive problem. The profile didn't match anyone in the criminal database. Their predator was a clean man. He had no major felony convictions. He didn't have a DNA sample on file. He was a shadow with a genetic code, but no name. They were at a total standstill. They had the killer's blueprint, but no face to put it on. That was until a controversial new forensic technique, one that had never been used in a case of this magnitude, offered a final, desperate chance to bridge the gap between the 80s and the present day. By 2008, the LAPD was staring at a wall. They had the DNA of a monster, but that DNA was a ghost in the system. Because Lonnie Franklin Jr. had managed to keep his criminal record relatively minor, mostly property crimes and minor arrests that didn't require a DNA swab at the time. His genetic profile wasn't in CODIS. The state's massive database of offenders was silent. The task force was desperate. They were watching a serial killer operate in real time, and they were powerless to identify him. That's when they turned to a cutting edge, highly controversial technique: Familial DNA searching. At the time, this was a legal and ethical minefield. Instead of looking for a perfect 100% match, investigators asked the database to look for a partial match, someone who shared enough genetic markers to be a close relative of the killer. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but only looking for needles that shared the same DNA as the one that had already pricked you. The first search in 2008 came up empty. The investigators were devastated, but they didn't give up. They waited. They knew that in a community under pressure, it was only a matter of time before someone in the killer's family tree had a run in with the law. In 2010, they ran the search again. This time, the computer spiked. There was a near perfect familial match in the system, but it wasn't the grim sleeper. It was a young man named Christopher Franklin. Christopher had recently been arrested on a firearms charge, and as part of his processing, his DNA had been entered into the state database. The software confirmed it. Christopher Franklin was the son of the man who had been terrorizing South Los Angeles for 2.5 decades. Suddenly, the ghost had a last name. The task force began to look into Christopher's father, a 57-year-old man named Lonnie Franklin Jr. On paper, the profile fit with terrifying precision. Lonnie lived in the heart of the killing zone, 81st Street, right in the center of where the bodies had been discovered. He had been a resident of the area since the early 80s. He was a mechanic. He drove a dark-colored vehicle, similar to the one described by the survivor in Nitra, Washington, 20 years earlier. But a familial match isn't enough for an arrest warrant. You can't put a man on death row because his son got arrested. The police needed Lonnie's actual DNA. They needed a direct, one-to-one match. But how do you get the DNA of a man who knows the police are looking for him? A man who spent his life fixing police cars and knows exactly how evidence is gathered. They couldn't just knock on his door and ask for a cheek swab. Lonnie was smart. He was cautious. He was a predator who had survived 25 years of scrutiny by staying invisible. If they tipped him off, he would disappear. Or worse, he would destroy the evidence of the decades of crimes he had committed. The investigators began a 24-hour surveillance operation. They watched him go to work. They watched him run errands. They waited for him to sneeze into a tissue, to discard a cigarette butt, or to spit on the sidewalk. But Lonnie was meticulous. He didn't leave anything behind. He was a man who understood the value of what he left in the trash. The conflict had reached a fever pitch. The police were sitting blocks away from a serial killer, watching him live his life, while the families of his victims waited for justice that was 25 years overdue. They needed a break, a moment of weakness, a single discarded item that Lonnie didn't think was important. And that's when Lonnie Franklin Jr. decided to go to a birthday party at a local pizza parlor. July 7th, 2010. A popular pizza parlor in South Los Angeles is buzzing with the sounds of a birthday celebration. Families are laughing, kids are running around, and in the corner, a 57-year-old Lonnie Franklin Jr. is finishing a meal. He's relaxed. He's in his element. He has no reason to believe that the young man in the apron clearing nearby tables is actually an undercover detective with the LAPD's Elite Robbery Homicide Division. The busboy operation was a masterclass in patience. The detective watched every move Lonnie made. He waited for him to take a bite, to sip his drink, to wipe his mouth with a napkin. The moment Lonnie stood up to leave, the detective moved in. He didn't just clear the table. He treated every item Lonnie touched like a priceless artifact. He bagged a partially eaten pizza crust, a used napkin, a plastic cup, and a fork. The samples were rushed to the lab for special priority processing. For 25 years, the DNA profile of the sleeper had been a sequence of numbers on a screen. Now, the lab technicians were comparing those numbers to the DNA extracted from a discarded pepperoni pizza crust. The result was a 100% match. The ghost finally had a face. On July 7th, 2010, a massive tactical team descended on Lonnie's home on West 81st Street. As the handcuffs clicked shut on the man the neighbors called Good Old Lonnie, the investigators began a search that would last for days. They knew they would find evidence, but they weren't prepared for the scale of the horror tucked away in the garage and the attic of that modest house. Inside, they found a literal house of secrets. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was a hoarder of memories. They recovered a .25 caliber handgun, the same weapon that had been used to end lives decades earlier. But the most chilling discovery was a collection of over 1,000 photographs and hundreds of hours of video footage. These weren't family snapshots, they were trophies. The photos depicted hundreds of women, many of them partially clothed, many of them appearing to be unconscious or in states of extreme distress. Some were posed in the very vehicles Lonnie used for his hunting. As the FBI and LAPD began the grueling process of cataloging the images, they realized the terrifying truth. The 10 murders Lonnie was officially charged with were likely just the tip of a massive dark iceberg. Among the photos, they found a picture of Anitra Washington, the survivor who had described the flashbulb in 1988. There she was, bleeding and slumped in his car, a digital record of the moment he thought he had successfully taken her life. The search turned up jewelry, ID cards, and clothing belonging to women who had been missing for years. It became clear that the sleep was a total fabrication. Lonnie hadn't been dormant. He had been refining his process, keeping his trophies organized, and living a double life as a pillar of the community by day and a predator of the vulnerable by night. The climax of the investigation wasn't just the arrest, it was the shattering of a neighborhood's sense of reality. The man who had fixed their cars and watched their children was revealed to be a collector of human tragedy. The net had finally closed, but as the investigators looked at the thousands of unidentified faces in those photos, they realized the work was only just beginning. Every serial killer leaves a scar on the city they inhabit, but the grim sleeper left a canyon. The most haunting part of this case isn't just what Lonnie Franklin Jr. did, it's what the system allowed to happen. For over 20 years, the LAPD knew that a serial killer was operating in South Los Angeles. They had the ballistics, they had the DNA, and they had a survivor's testimony. Yet, they chose to keep that information secret. They claimed they didn't want to panic the community or tip off the suspect. But while the authorities were staying silent in their offices, women in South LA were still getting into cars with a man they thought was a friendly neighbor. They were walking into a trap that the police knew existed but never warned them about. This raises a massive ethical question that I want you to weigh in on in the comments. Do you believe the LAPD was justified in keeping the serial killer's existence a secret to protect the investigation? Or was this a fundamental betrayal of a community that was already being overlooked? If this had been happening in a wealthier, whiter neighborhood like Beverly Hills or Santa Monica, do you think the police would have waited 20 years to issue a public warning? And there's an even darker layer to this. When the police searched Lonnie's house, they found photos of 180 different women that they could not identify. These women were posed in his car, in his house, and many looked like they were sleeping or worse. The LAPD eventually released these photos to the public, asking for help to find out who they were. To this day, many remain a mystery. How many more victims do you think are actually out there? We know about the 10 he was convicted of, but with over 1,000 photos and hundreds of hours of video, could the true number be in the hundreds? I want to hear your theories. Why do you think Lonnie slept for those 14 years? Or do you think, as the evidence suggests, that he never stopped at all and the system just failed to see him? Drop a comment below. I'm looking forward to a deep discussion on this one because it's a case that forces us to look at the parts of society we often choose to ignore. The trial of Lonnie Franklin Jr. began in 2016, nearly 6 years after his arrest, and 3 decades after his first known murder. Throughout the proceedings, Lonnie sat in the courtroom with a look of calm indifference. He watched as the families of his victims wept, and he listened as Anitra Washington looked him in the eye and told the jury exactly what he had done to her. He never took the stand, he never offered an explanation, and most importantly, he never offered a single word of remorse. It took the jury less than a day to find him guilty of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The judge, in a scathing final statement, called him a serial killer who was also a serial liar. He was sentenced to death, but the state of California would never carry out that sentence. On March 28, 2020, at the age of 67, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead shortly after. He took his secrets with him to the grave, including the identities of the women in those 180 photographs and the location of any other remains that have yet to be found. The legacy of the Grim Sleeper isn't just one of violence, it's a landmark in criminal justice. His case was the first major use of familial DNA searching in the United States, a technique that has since been used to catch the Golden State Killer and solve hundreds of other cold cases. But that forensic victory came at a staggering human cost, a cost paid by the families of South Los Angeles, who spent 25 years wondering why no one was listening. Lonnie Franklin Jr. wanted to be a collector of souls, a man who kept the evidence of his crimes tucked away in an attic for his own private viewing. But today, he is remembered only as a failure, a man whose own biology eventually betrayed him and whose victims finally found their voices in a courtroom he couldn't control. The sleep is finally over. If you found this deep dive into the hunt for the Grim Sleeper compelling, and you want to see more content where we analyze the forensic breakthroughs that crack the world's most difficult cases, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell the stories that deserve to be heard. And if you're ready for another chilling case, click the video on your screen right now to see more. The next story is just as dark as this one, and you won't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.